Well, hello there. As you can obviously read from the title of the video, this is about 23 Years by the Sword and how good it is. It is a short story that is going to appear in the video game Wayward Realms, and I'm going to go through it to discuss it and see how good of a book within the game it is. And before I mention that, I do want to say thanks to everyone who watched the video that I made about Thief's Fall, and especially on the Once Lost Games group for just sharing my video. It's very nice. I didn't expect them to do that. I didn't expect anyone to watch it, but I'm glad people watched it and liked it, you know. If you have anything to say that would help me improve, I do know I can improve on a lot of things, then do say. But yeah, if you want to skip to the analysis portion where I actually just talk about the book itself, that will be located in the description and the comment section below. So for anyone who's new to here, and for me to set the basis on what we're actually going to be talking about here, is that we are going to be talking about how good this book is on 3 criteria, or guidelines more it is. And those guidelines are: 1, how relevant it is to the world; 2, does it tell us something about the world; and 3, is it a good story? And for example, how relevant it is to the world is, all the things that are in this book going to show up in the game. That's as basic as you can get. And does it tell us about something about the world? And while the first can obviously be included in the second, they're both different in a certain way. So for example, if you tell us something about the world that is completely irrelevant to the game, that is about some sort of king who died 100 years ago and is in a land like 100,000 kilometers away, that's not particularly relevant. Even though if it is a good story and it does tell us something about it, it's not particularly relevant. It doesn't mean it's bad to have it in the game, just that to me most books would have that, and it's generally a good thing for them to have that. So yeah, I'm going to go read through this for anyone who doesn't want to, read it themselves. But if you do want to read it, that'll also be in the description below. So let's get to it. 23 Years by the Sword. The Memoirs of Alexandre de Leponze, 5th book. Now, I also just want to express as well, I'm not going to be able to pronounce any of these names. This is a dwarf book as well, and my gosh, is it a hard thing to pronounce some of these names. So bear with me, please. The various skilled masters of the dwarven people would have you believe that they were far beyond the crude and barbaric vice that they labeled the dueling art. This is a lie. Dueling is alive and well among the dwarves, as it is among all the peoples of the archipelago, whether it is to be found in its informal back alley from between a brace of young bravados, or in the custom-laden form so labeled as dispute settlements between dwarves of means, or in the legal form of the dwarven judicator duel. The art holds many opportunities in dwarven lands for an aspiring duelist to make their name, or simply to cut their teeth and perhaps a few careless guarded chests. Despite the fascinating variance in the manner of dueling to be found in the dwarven lands, however, the squat, compact dwarven physiology presents a certain constant which could provide the downfall of young, unprepared duelists. If, however, my good reader, you hearken well to the sound advice contained in this volume, back by my personal experiences, one of which I shall forthwith recount, then you shall find a dwarven duelist as surmountable obstacle, and in fact something of an interesting challenge. It's needn't to be mentioned that the dwarves are a short people besides the goblins. They are the shortest of the civilized folk inhabiting our fair archipelago. The disparity in size between the dwarf and nearly any other gentle being there may encounter presents challenges to both parties. The dwarf will find that many of their opponents' vital points are well above their own, necessitating upward strikes to inflict the sort of wounds that will end a duel quickly, while the other duelist has quite the opposite problem in that beyond the dwarf's head all the vital points are far lower than normal and thus require downward strikes, or else the duelist is forced to lower their stance. In both cases, the combatants are hampered by the shortening of effective reach by overall the situation heavily favors the dwarf experience has taught that heads are much harder to hit in the midst of combat than one might think, and the opponent's legs are at a perfect height for the dwarf to strike. An opponent whose legs have been cut is still perfectly dangerous, of course, but will be drastically reduced in their mobility. And dwarves are rightfully framed for being almost preternaturally nimble. There is a saying among dwarven lands that seems particularly apt. The bigger they are, the harder they fall once you chop off their leg. Such were the realities of my situation as I found myself involved in a judicator duel in the year 1248, acting as the appointed champion to an old friend, one Bjorn Ulfersson, member in a good standing in the Bejatic League in the old dwarfen outpost of, and this is going to be really hard to pronounce, so please bear with me, Borgai Hiedien, the town on the hill near Coventry. Although it would be more accurate, I believe, to call it the town of the hill, given how many of the original longhouses and modern patricians are built right into the hillside. I'm told that the hill was once covered in mighty oaks. Indeed, the original name of Borgahiedin was Triegeg of the Treebeard, or the Treebeard. Such was the dwarfen efficiency, however, in converting the trees into stout naval vessels, that soon all that was left of the poor Triegeg was the logging town which they, as the dwarfs invariably do, have built as they were working. Not wanting a perfectly good community to go to waste, the dwarfs repurposed their sawmills into textile mills and continued right on working, never missing a beat or a sail. Very industrious people, the dwarfs. But on that particular day, I was not free to enjoy the history of this old dwarfen town. Rather, I was at the base of the hill, where a small cleared area provided space for judicator duels since the very founding of Björgheden. My opponent, one Olfur Björnsson, unrelated, stood before me, his fiery mane and beard framing a fierce scowl. As in my custom when facing such opponents, I affect an air of uncaring ease, arms folded, whistling a catchy tune, while the formalities of the charges were read by the most dour-faced judge. Judging by the way old Olafur's eyebrows came together, I dare say that my stratagem was working with more than its usual efficacy that day. Unfortunately, in the world of dueling, mind games may sometimes only go so far. Dwarven judicator duels are stepped into the ancient tradition of their kind, back when they were raiders and pillagers in their frigid homeland of Nilhim. Each combatant is armed with a simple broad-bladed sword, the length of which is set by a long-forgotten decree, and a round wooden shield held in the center, reinforced with a boss over the grip. No other arms or armor are allowed. There are laws which allow for opponents to also carry a short spear, or to have the spare shield held by a second in case the first is damaged beyond use. But my opponent was, as was the defendant's right, waived those options, presumably to demonstrate his skill against a duelist of my fame and stature. The judge, the Right Honorable Johann Sebastian van Siebenbergen, called for the duel to begin. Time slowed to my eyes as it always did. I could see the wicked gleam of Ulfur's eyes, the same wicked gleam I'd seen in many prior opponents, and in many cutthroats, who meant to leave my guts spilled on the ground. Ulfur's shields and mine clashed, each of us seeking the bind, just as one would win a Sikarin rapier or saber. Initially, I thought myself in the superior position, for my greater height would surely afford me an advantage in leverage. I was soon shown the error of such thinking. Ulfur presented the squat crossguard of his sword against the shield, which, combined with the size of the hammerhead pommel one finds on many older dwarfen-style blades, created an excellent brace with the two hands on his shield to my one. He easily held fast as he darted, and I was forced to hop back just as the hard rim of his shield crashed into my legs, toppling me over like a squire on his first joust. I hoped my disengagement would give me a moment to reassess the situation, but old Ulfr was a canny fighter, full of vigor. Using the famed dwarven nimbleness to full effect, he rushed me again before I could recover. His body behind and under his shields, his sword once again used to brace. Again, I hopped back, ever mindful of the border that marked the dueling circle. Crossing that would have cost me the duel, as well as no small amount of reputation, for I've never been once driven out of bounds. The duel continued in this fashion for some time, as I soon discerned Ulfr's stratagem. Where I strike with my blades, his shield would ward off any blows long enough for him to bowl over me. Were I to stand and meet his charge, his smaller size put him below my center of balance, affording him an advantage I dared not let him enjoy. Were I to lower my stance in order to wrestle with him on more even terms, he would dart back, exploiting his greater nimbleness to circle around me, while I exhausted my stamina in holding such a low stance. With me on the defensive, forced to make the greater, more exhausting movements, it was but a matter of time before Ulfr tired me out, and I found a chink in my defenses. It seemed that Ulfr had taken my measure, and indeed, for a moment I myself wondered if this was so. Those witnessing our duel certainly seemed to think so. Their faces shared a look of finality, a group consensus drawn before the final blow was struck. Poor Bjorn was hiding his eyes under his hat, so as to not witness his inevitable loss of the case. Even the judge seemed certain of my defeat, leaning forward in his seat, impatient for Ulfr to end what was being seen as less of a duel and more of a farce. Good reader, no blade can sting a true duelist worse than the vicious stare of one who makes small of your hard-earned skills. Duels have been won and lives lost because of such unthinking stares. In that moment, I saw how to turn my opponent's strength against him, and to prove to the dwarfs that their stature is not always the advantage they think it to be. I flashed Bjorn a dashing smile, and I told him, "Worry not, friend, and worry not, old friend. I'm not out of tricks yet. You best not be." Bjorn moaned into his hat. I'll be a ruined dwarf if you're not." He really is a good friend, dear reader, though like many dwarves he is prone to a bit short-sighted at times. Once again, Ulfr rushed me, his shield held ready to ram into my belly. I dropped into a low stance as to meet him head on, his head blocked by my own shield. Ulfr could not see what I was doing, but the witnesses all murmured, expecting the duel to end with the next exchange. With Ulfr triumphant and me either defeated or dead, I could see from the corner of my eye the judge pulling himself up straight, ready to call the final blow. Ulfr came in with the force of a charging bull, but he met only air. As he grew near, I uncoiled my legs, planting my shield flat against his. Ulfr's own momentum carried him under me, as I used our shields as a platform, vaulting over my compact opponent. I had to let go of my shield in the exchange, but the end result was well worth it. Ulfr now rushing away from me, in his back open and unprotected, and me with the blade in my hand, flickering out a stab with the speed and grace born of countless hours of practice and dedication. Ulfr staggered another dozen or so feet, leaving a trail of blood as he went. Before he fell, a heavy wound in his side. With no small amount of satisfaction, I bowed to the right and honorable judge and bade him to please call for a surgeon to tend to my opponent, who had fought with skill and honor, and given me a worthy challenge. Ulfr, I later learned, survived his wound, and even made something of a stink about my innovative tactic not being legal, but the result of that being a bit bombastic brain is a story for another volume. I will conclude with one by mentioning that the look of utter confoundedness that came over Jean-Sebastian van Siebenbergen's face as he finally processed what happened. He has remained one of my more treasured memories to this day. So, that was 23 years by the sword, the memoirs of Alexander D. Lopanzi 5th book. And it was pretty good. I gotta say, from the prior book, it is a improvement on all three fronts, and it's just a much better story overall. And not to diss the previous work, it was also really good as well, but this one is such an improvement in quality. And now why is that? Well, for one, it's a much clearer what this book is going for, and I do want to make an amendment on my first video. I did miss crucial context that was important when it was released. It was released in October, and it was intended to be a more scarier side and looking at more of a darker side of the Wayward Realms. And that was my fault, and I neglected to mention that I should have not just looked on how relevant it was to the world in a direct comparison, but also in an indirect thing, what it said subtly as well. And this one is a lot better in nearly every manner, as I said before. And now let's go through that. 1. What does it tell us about the world? Well, it tells us about two things. 1, it tells us about duelists, and it tells us about dwarves. Now, obviously, I think this book is going to be found by the player and is going to give us a level up in a certain skill. Now, this is obviously inspired by Daggerfall, and in Daggerfall, you were able to find skill books which increase your skills, and I believe this book is also going to be doing that as well. And I gotta say, it is an interesting story with it as well. A lot of the skill books within the Elder Scrolls series, while not bad, are not necessarily good books in themselves. And this one certainly breaks that trend and in being a very good book. And let's talk about the more overt things. So obviously it talks about the dwarfen people. Now, a lot of the times when fantasy races are now put into different contexts, sometimes it can be a bit off-putting, because when you hear the name elf, what does that bring up? It brings up tropes such as Lord of the Rings and some D&D elves as well. And it's this elegant, graceful, connected with nature. The same thing with dwarves as well. But to me, what makes a race connected to its original roots is, does it have the core components? And the dwarves still have the core components in this iteration as well. And instead of being miners who dig deep underground, they are sailors, they are boatsmen. As it says here, where is it? Yeah, they converted the trees into stout naval vessels. And that is, while different from making things what normally associated with dwarves, like siege engines, gyrocopters, or other mechanical marvels, it is still core to what dwarves are, which is craftsmen. And within that, and within this one as well, the Alexandro mentions that they're also very industrious people. And that is important to note because it still retains the coreness of what a dwarf is. And to me, I think that is really good, and I like that a lot about about Wayward Realms. It still carries the core concepts of what these races are, but it puts them in different contexts and different environments, and we can see how that plays out. It's still them, but it's with a lot of different aesthetics and associations and even new concepts to go along with them. And I think that is done very well. It's also in line with what the Wayward Realms wants to do, which is it wants to present these races not as inherently one thing, but they're, as I said before in my previous video, if you would put them in a different context, they would be different people. So if you take a orc and they would be raised by a human, they would be different people. They wouldn't be inherently. The only difference is that they are larger and stronger than most people, but that is not really relevant because their morality, their thoughts, their beliefs, their culture would be more aligned with their human parents than it would be their orc race. And yeah, that's definitely a mark for the Wayward Realms on this. And as the second point, it tells us about dueling. Dueling is a really core component from my understanding of the Wayward Realms. From my understanding from looking at the gameplay, they wanted to make it a lot more realistic, but not totally realistic. Obviously it is a game and they still need to have fun in this ultimately, but from reading this, it looks like they've taken a great means to account for all of the intricacies of each races. As it says here, the disparity in sizes between the dwarf and nearly other gentle being may encounter presents challenges for both parties, and it does. and that's definitely a point for it as well. And now, what about the relevance towards the plot? Now, again, I don't necessarily know what the story of the Wayward Realms is going to be, but I do think that, you know, this character, whether we may meet him or not, is going to be relevant in showing different cultures in the archipelago. And since this is the 5th book, there's obviously more books out there, and it ends off with he'll tell more books. So clearly, this is a step up on relevancy to the actual world itself. And in my previous video, I also mentioned there was a city that was called Contrever over here, and it's also mentioned here. So this is, for me at least, since it's been mentioned in 2 books, means that it's going to be relevant in the game actually, and you may be able to visit it. Now again, this is speculation, I'm not necessarily sure for certain, but if it's been mentioned within 2 books, it must then be some sort of relevance, and the player may be able to visit it as well. Now, what about the last point, which is it a good story? And I gotta say, for me, it is a really good story. Not only from the first person's perspective of Alexandro, but also just the insights it gives us to everything, and how well written it is in this sort of dashing rogue who's famed across the archipelago and who has never really met defeat, and I like it a lot. I think it is really good. Any other criticisms I think you can make of this is more the fact that the dwarves aren't really traditional dwarves, which I think is undermined by the fact that the dwarves, in traditional sense, still exist in the archipelago. If you look at interviews and other sources of media from the Wayward Realms, you find out that there are still traditional dwarves. It's just that the dwarves in the archipelago are ones that moved towards the archipelago, and I find that really cool as well. We also get some other smaller tidbits, some more subtle world building, such as we get that this is the sort of calendar system that they're using. We don't necessarily, I'm not sure if there's an AD, CD, or any sort of thing like that. We also get naming conventions to how the dwarves name things, the sort of Icelandic, Nordic usage, which is also really relevant because since these dwarves are more sea people, it is really cool that they're taking inspirations from the Vikings. As you can obviously see from the picture over here, he obviously has some braids and beard that are more reminiscent of Vikings instead of the much more poofier, larger, and more ornated beards of traditional dwarves. And there are a bunch of other smaller details within this, such as, again, when we get to, where was it? When he was talking about his friend? Yeah. When he mentioned that he was on his friend's side, Bjorn Ulfarsson, and he was fighting an opponent called Ulfar Bjornsson, which in real life, you will see a lot of naming conventions. A lot of people in Western Europe are called John for obvious reasons, and then a lot of people in the Middle East are called Mohammed for obvious reasons. And it is interesting to see that naming convention also carried throughout, because it does make it feel a lot more realistic, which is also one of the goals of the Wayward Realms, is to feel a lot more realistic, and that these are people that you can interact with and aren't just ideas or concepts. And I gotta say, this is a step in the right direction, and I absolutely love this book a lot, and I do hope to see more of this, not only within the game, but also as I continue reading these books as well. So if you think I may have missed something, or you think I may have lacked some context that could have changed one of the topics, one of the things that I said, please do tell. And if you did enjoy it or didn't, please do say as well down below. And again, thanks for anyone who watched the video from before. It was really nice to see so many people sharing their kind words, and even being shared by the official account as well. I wasn't expecting that. I don't necessarily expect it to continue to happen. I don't want to get my hopes up, but I do thank anyone who watched this, and even the official ones, the official account, for watching this as well. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.